Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Max Latona, and I'm the Executive Director of the Center for Ethics and Society here at Saint Anselm College. I'd like to welcome all of you to today's webinar on corporate social responsibility. In a moment, I will introduce my colleague here at the college, who will in turn introduce our speaker for today. Before I do so, I'd like to take this occasion to articulate the mission of the Center for Ethics and Society, which is to bring about thoughtful collaboration among individuals, organizations, and communities in order to address the variety of important issues that we all face. It's important to note here that in order to accomplish this mission, the Center remains fundamentally nonpartisan and inclusive in its approach and welcomes diversity of all types, including a variety of academic, social, political, and ideological perspectives. Today's program provides a good example of diversity of perspective. Corporate social responsibility, or CSR as it's more commonly known, has become almost axiomatic in business ethics and in public perception. We expect corporations to restrain their profit-making with active concern for our environment, for our communities, for issues of social justice. Indeed, over the years, our center has had numerous prominent and thoughtful speakers who have made the case for corporate social responsibility in one way or another. But today's speaker will represent a possible difference of perspective, as he will raise some concerns of an ethical sort about CSR, about something that most of us think is an unquestioned assumption or expectation for the modern day corporation. His talk promises to be thought-provoking and possibly even a little controversial. In the final analysis, whether you are convinced by our speaker or not, I hope that you will agree that hearing both sides of an issue is valuable, and that listening to a thoughtful analysis can help us challenge our own assumptions, sharpen our own reasoning, and deepen our understanding of an issue. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce my colleague, Dina Frutos-Benzi. Dina is an associate professor of economics and business here at Saint Anselm College, and someone who has had practical experience in the corporate world, which explains, I think, in part her interest in questions of corporate responsibility. So Dina?
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Max, for the introduction. And I also would like to welcome you all to this first webinar presentation of our series, Corporations and the Common Good, featuring Dr. Alexei Marcoux. Today's event is the latest installment in the Ethics in Governance Speaker Series. Funding for the Ethics in Governance program comes from a $2 million endowment created by the New Hampshire Secretary of State's office and the Center for Public Responsibility and Corporate Citizenship, awarded to Saint Anselm College in 2013. The endowment was created from a settlement reached between the New Hampshire Securities Bureau and Tyco International Ltd. In 2002. And it is administered by the University of New Hampshire Foundation. The Ethics in Governance Forum features programs on topics related to governance, leadership, social responsibilities, and the common good. Social responsibility and the common good. And as Max was saying, right, the leaders of our corporations and institutions have a profound effect on whether or not the common good is promoted. So I am particularly pleased to welcome Dr. Alexei Marcoux, Professor of Business Ethics and Society and Senior Scholar of the Institute of Economic Inquiry in Creighton University's Hyder College of Business. He is a popular teacher and invited lecturer. He has held visiting appointments at the University of Pennsylvania's Wharton School, St. Cloud State University, and the Social Philosophy and Policy Center. Professor Marcoux's research focuses on moral foundations of commercial transactions and embraces topics like reservation price deception and markets as models of liberal toleration. A two-time winner of the Best Paper Award at the Society for Business Ethics annual meeting, he has published scholarly articles in numerous journals like Journal of Business Ethics, Journal of Social Entrepreneurship, and Reason papers. He is co-author of 2 textbooks, Case Studies in Business Ethics and The Ethics of Business, A Concise Introduction. He's also co-editor of the in Press Routledge Companion to Business Ethics. So before I turn over this introduction to our guest speaker, let me give you some instructions about the Q&A. Hopefully all of you are seeing at the bottom that you have this Q&A feature. So please submit your questions at any point during or after the presentation. Please type them into the Q&A box. My role, one of my roles will be to moderate and kind of monitor the questions that you are typing there. So at the end of the presentation of Dr. Marcoux, we can have that, we can address them, or he can address them. I also would like to let you know that in accordance with New Hampshire state law, I'm required to inform you that this webinar is being recorded. So now that we have all these housekeeping out of the way, please join me in welcoming Dr. Marcoux this afternoon.
Thank you. Thank you, Dina, for the kind introduction. I have some thank yous that I would like to tender myself before I get started. I'd like to thank Dina, I'd like to thank Hannah, I'd like to thank Max, and what I'm sure is a cast of unseen thousands at the Saint Anselm College Center for Ethics and Society for inviting me to talk to you today about reasons for being skeptical about CSR. I'd also like to thank the Institute for Humane Studies at George Mason University for a course buyout grant that supports the research out of which today's talk falls. And finally, I'd like to thank the Menard Family Institute for Economic Inquiry at Creighton University's Hyder College of Business, where I'm employed, because they just love me and for the most part let me do what I want, and that's a beautiful thing. So without further ado, let's share the screen and get into what we're doing here today. All right. I'd like to start this way. I would like to say, in a simple world, it's hard not to love the idea of CSR. And so one way to understand my remarks today would be as suggesting that the world is not as simple as it needs to be for CSR to deliver what its champions promise. The considerations that I identify today for being skeptical to CSR, they don't foreclose the possibility of legitimate CSR activity. But they should, I think, have implications for our level of enthusiasm for CSR. And also, they should have implications for which institutions and for which firms are well positioned to deliver CSR. Now I would like to say something about why we should be skeptical about CSR. Let's begin with what I will call the problem of diversity. Here we are at Saint Anselm College. Here I am at Creighton University. Colleges and universities love diversity, or at least they love diversity. They love diversity to the extent that it's diversity of a certain kind. Right now, racial diversity is a real biggie at universities. If you're talking about racial diversity, you've got everyone's ear. Gender diversity may not have the resonance that race does at the moment, but boy, that's a big one. Class diversity used to be bigger. Now it really seems to be dropping down the charts. But outside of those things, people are diverse in many ways that universities are not always interested in talking about or making part of their pitch or their appeal for why you should attend there, what you should study there, and so forth. But diversity is very important for my topic because people are diverse not only by way of race, not only by way of gender, not only by way of class, but people are diverse in a very fundamentally important way for my topic today. People are diverse in terms of their views and their values, right? The only person who probably agrees with you on absolutely everything is you, right? You may have significant overlap with some people, you may have almost no overlap with other people, but at the end of the day, right, there is not a whole lot of agreement about views and values. And so if we live in a pluralistic society, the diverse and pluralistic society that we live in is not unified by a set of views and values, right? And so this is important because it raises an epistemic challenge to CSR. Epistemology is that branch of philosophy that concerns itself with the theory of knowledge and with questions like, what does it mean to know something, right? What does it mean to say something is true, etc., right? In order to pursue CSR, in order to pursue the common good, right, we need to have agreement on things like views and values. But agreement on views and values is relatively thin on the ground. I don't have to tell you that what is discussed under the heading of political polarization is itself a reflection of this. And of course, the polarization in our society is political, but it is not only political, right? People have different conceptions of the good life. They have different conceptions of what a well-lived life is. And all of these things are going to be implicated, right, in our conception of what corporate social responsibility is and what business firms under the heading of corporate social responsibility should pursue. So one problem that we have, I think, with enthusiasm for CSR is there seems to be a rather blithe assurance on the part of those who are enthusiastic about CSR, who think that business firms should be doing ever more in a CSR direction, that the views and the values that will be reflected in the CSR activities will be ones with which they agree. Well, we'll see if that turns out to be true. There's a second challenge that attends corporate social responsibility. Let's call this the challenge of competence, right? So even if we can get past the problem of diversity of views and of values, we still have the question, are business firms as organizations or as institutions, and are business people, right, as the vehicles through which institutions and organizations actually get things done, competent to deliver corporate social responsibility? Are they competent to deliver socially responsible action in response to calls to engage in corporate social responsibility, right? Business firms are, at least presumptively, highly competent to do some things, but yet they're not particularly competent to do others. On which side of that divide does CSR fall, right? That's another challenge for CSR, right? And so this we might call the technocratic objection to CSR. The idea that, well, maybe we can reach agreement on what is socially responsible, right? What is good for the society or good for the community? But then the question is, are business firms the right vehicle for delivering it? I mean, we know from history why it is that business firms in general and corporations in particular have been the object of calls for CSR, right? One very important one is because, at least in terms of certain views and values, the things that business firms do, what do I want to say? Mundanely, things that business firms do every day. The things that we think of as the things that business firms do are things that a lot of people disagree with. Or if they don't disagree with them, they believe that they have harmful side effects that should be ameliorated in some way. And the thought is that CSR might be one of those ameliorative functions. Another reason why business firms have been the object of calls for socially responsible action is because at least the big ones, the ones we know about, are repositories of a great deal of capital assets that at least in principle could be deployed to deliver corporate social responsibility. But again, the question is raised whether business organizations and business people are competent to deliver corporate social responsibility, right? The third challenge that arises for corporate social responsibility is what I'm going to call the challenge of dutiful service. Now, I'm not altogether pleased with the imagery that I have here on this slide. Let me give you an idea. Let me tell you what I'm going for here so that we can make sense of the image, and then I can back into why it presents a challenge for CSR. The man standing behind, the man sitting in the shirt and tie and boxing gloves, is a boxing cornerman, right? The job of being a cornerman in a boxing match is a particularly interesting one to me, because the cornerman's job is to render dutiful service to the fighter in whose corner the cornerman sits, right? So if you were to say to a boxing cornerman, well, you have a social responsibility to, for example, avoid throwing in the towel too soon if your boxer is getting beaten to a pulp, so that the audience can enjoy a continued boxing match, I think we would understand, I hope we would understand, that that's simply wrong, right? The cornerman's duty is to look out for the well-being, right, and the good of the boxer, whether or not that redounds to the benefit of the audience. What does this have to do with corporate social responsibility? The answer is this, right? The question is, can corporate social responsibility initiatives be pursued by business firms, and particularly for-profit investor-owned corporations, consistent with the duties of care and loyalty that the directors and officers of the corporation owe to the shareholders of that corporation? To the extent that it can, right, then there is a space for CSR. But to the extent that the expenditures on socially responsible activities come at the expense of those to whom the directors and officers have those duties, it raises a problem of fidelity or a problem of dutiful service. Call this the fiduciary challenge to corporate social responsibility. Now, you might have heard everything that I've said so far, and you might say, you know what, Professor Marcoux, so what? What you're talking about, and I readily concede this, what you're talking about is the status quo. But my whole interest in pursuing, or a significant part of my interest in pursuing corporate social responsibility is to disrupt the status quo, right? That is, it is to effectuate a kind of change, right? Maybe the sorts of norms, maybe the sorts of undertakings that you apparently seem to champion, right, are ones that are in tune with the norms and practices and values and institutions that we have. But my interest in CSR is to change the norms, the institutions, the values, etc. I say, well, that's a legitimate thought, right? There is nothing untoward, there is nothing wrong about seeking reform. But this, for CSR, as for anything else, raises what I will call the challenge of change, right? What are the legitimate means by which we can change the institutions, the practices, and the norms that we have? Right. So in other words, the question is this, right? Who or what has there it is, that's the one. Who or what has jurisdiction over what I will call here, as I called in the chapter of mine that apparently was the source of the invitation to speak to you today. Thank you to whoever read my chapter on that. It's the jurisdictional problem, right? Who has jurisdiction over the question of what is the social contract, as it were, between business and society? And by what means can we go about trying to effectuate change over that? And so here I'm regretting the ordering of my slides, for which I apologize. So the first cut at that question is this, right? Is the social contract between business and society a public question? That is a question to be handled through the political process, through governmental institutions, things like that. Or is the jurisdiction private? That is it something to be worked out on a firm by firm, case by case basis? One of the things that I find most interesting about corporate social responsibility and activism for and enthusiasm for things that go on under its heading is that on the one hand, there is this idea that the social responsibility is a responsibility to society, that is to the public, but that the means by which it is supposed to be effectuated is in negotiations, say, between the C-level executives at a firm and an NGO or what have you, right? Whereas others might say, well, you know what? It might be legitimate to change the social contract between business and society, but in order for it to be legitimate, it must be the outcome of the political process. That is basically the result of victories won in a democratic political process, right? So call this the challenge of change, right? Now, what's interesting about all four of these challenges to me, or I should say, among the things that are interesting about all four of these challenges to me, are that they are all anticipated. None of them originate with me. They are all anticipated in the public intellectual work of Milton Friedman. Milton Friedman, the 1976 Nobel Memorial Prize in Economic Sciences winner, for his contributions to monetary theory. He almost single-handedly, I say almost because his most important work he co-authored with one Anna Schwartz. He almost single-handedly, or not single-handedly, and with Anna Schwartz, revived the quantity theory of money. This is the idea that something like inflation, something that is really big in the news right now, inflation is, in Friedman's famous words, always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. When Friedman took up the issue, the quantity theory of money was thought to be dead and buried. By the time he finished publishing his monetary theory of the United States with Anna Schwartz, people went from thinking it was all a fiscal phenomenon to thinking that it was almost all a monetary phenomenon. And right now, we may, I emphasize the word we may be paying the price of failing to follow, to heed Friedman's thoughts on monetary theory, right? But of course, Friedman was more than a monetary theorist. For the latter half of his career, he was a public intellectual. And one of the things that he concerned himself with in his 1962 book, Capitalism and Freedom, in his either famous or notorious 1970 New York Times Magazine piece, The Social Responsibility of Business is to Increase Its Profits, was the question of CSR. And while he did not use the terminology that I have used, the epistemic, the technocratic, the fiduciary, and the jurisdictional concerns inform what he has to say about the social responsibilities of business. It's beyond the scope of my talk today to go into the ins and outs of his views, the ways in which Friedman has been misinterpreted, the ways in which Friedman has been basically interpreted as being nothing more than the title of his New York Times Magazine piece. My friend and colleague Wayne Norman at Duke University, in a 2011 International Encyclopedia of Ethics piece, said, you know, we have no reason to suspect that the title of that piece is his. Right? If you've ever published an op-ed, a letter to the editor, anything like that, you usually don't have control over the title. The editors do that, and in the case of Milton Friedman's New York Times Magazine piece, they decided to run it as a cover story, and of course, to sell lots of magazines, it got this title, The Social Responsibility of Business is to Increase Its Profits. It's at least an open question whether Friedman would have agreed or did agree that that was actually a good title summarizing his viewpoint in that piece. Friedman is usually presented as a quote unquote shareholder theorist. There are a couple of things that bother me about that characterization. The first is that within my own field, business ethics, nobody knows and nobody cares to articulate what this shareholder theory is. Multiple encyclopedic references that have been published in the business ethics and CSR fields, none of them have an entry on this shareholder theory, of which supposedly Friedman is the leading exemplar. Right? So I'd feel better about the characterization if someone would say what the characterization actually means. Second thing that bothers me about it is something that my friend and colleague Doug Rasmussen, Professor Emeritus of Philosophy at St. John's University, pointed out to me recently. He said that there is a Marxian element in the characterization. What he was referring to is this, is that in calling Friedman a shareholder theorist, the suggestion is that any reasoning that he gives to support his view is just a smokescreen for class interest. In other words, Friedman is just in the pocket of the shareholding class. Right? What I want to say is that if you read Friedman carefully, and in order to do so, you have to read the whole book, Capitalism and Freedom, not just chapter 8, monopoly and the social responsibility of business and labor. You have to read more than just the title of the New York Times Magazine piece. You have to read the whole thing. You have to read other things that I and my current co-author, Jonathan Drake, at Creighton University, other things that we have unearthed that Friedman wrote on the topic to actually figure out what he was saying. Friedman's concerns, even with respect to the social responsibilities of business, are not fundamentally shareholder-centric concerns. That is because Friedman's fundamental concerns are liberal concerns. Liberal in the political philosophical sense. That is the idea that liberty is the paramount political value, right? Now, there are disagreements among liberals in the politico-philosophical sense about what sort of conception of liberty we should have, right? There are disagreements about what is entailed in that conception of liberty. And I'm not going to go into those things there. But the important thing to see is that if you read Friedman carefully, you see that if you take the title of his book, Capitalism and Freedom, the key word in the title is not capitalism and it's not and, it's freedom, right? Freedom as a reflection of the paramount political value of liberty that informs and that animates liberalism as a political philosophy, which, if I know which slide is coming up next, which makes this quote from Bill Galston. Bill Galston is a scholar at the Brookings Institute. Before that, he was professor of public policy at the University of Maryland. He also served in an undersecretary function in the Clinton administration. He is not the sort of person at first blush that you would enlist in support of anything Milton Friedman had to say. And yet, in a recent blog post at the Unpopulist, he wrote something very interesting that I actually think is important here, and that gets at one of my worries about corporate social responsibility. Galston writes, the antonym, that is the opposite of liberal, is not conservative, it is total. Total as in totalitarian. Liberal democracy is limited democracy. There is a zone of human affairs within which no government, even government by the majority, can legitimately operate. We can argue about how large is the zone, and we can argue about where the boundary is or where the perimeter is, but liberalism stands or falls on its existence. Otherwise put, liberalism distinguishes between the public and the private. And what I'd like to say is that I think one of Friedman's concerns about CSR, one of the things that elicits his very strong reaction to it, is the thought that it is, or it inadvertently supports, a totalized conception of society. That is, the idea that one's views and one's values must be reflected in all of the institutions, all of the practices, all of the laws that we have. But that is an idea that is antithetical to liberalism. And we know that this is one of Friedman's concerns, because the very first public intellectual piece he published was in Collier's way back in the 50s, and it was called Liberalism, Old Style. He was suggesting that in the intramural dispute among liberals, right, a certain unfortunate conception of liberty had taken hold to the detriment of what he thought was the proper one, with the threat being that we have a totalized conception of how views and values should affect us, right? So what does all of this mean? Why does it matter? Right? What might be a somewhat practical implication of the considerations that I have offered so far for being skeptical of CSR? Well, I think one way to try to get at it is through the person of one Bill Gates. Bill Gates is a remarkable human being for a number of reasons, too many reasons for me to recount here right now. But Bill Gates is remarkable in a relevant way to my talk, because he founded not one, but two organizations of immense importance to the world in which we live and its shape, right? One of those, of course, is Microsoft, which he founded in 1979, or excuse me, 75. Microsoft is among the most important, if not the most important business ever to, it's among the most important businesses, if it is not the most important business ever to be founded, right? Its implications for how we live, how we work, how we do things, and how we interact are profound, right? Microsoft is a big deal, right? But not to be, not to miss his curtain call, right? In the 1990s, I believe 1996, Bill Gates founded, with the riches that he derived from his stock holdings in Microsoft, he founded the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation does important work that shapes in fundamental ways the world in which we live. Right? Now, my point in bringing this up is not a compare and contrast of Microsoft and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. My reason for bringing up the two very different, one for-profit, one not-for-profit organizations that Bill Gates founded is that there seems to be a certain thrust or impetus to CSR that suggests something like the following: that this question is a live question. Would it have been better if Microsoft, right, the first organization that Bill Gates founded, had been both Microsoft and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation simultaneously? In other words, enthusiasm for CSR suggests that, in effect, there's no need for a Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Microsoft should just do it, right? How would Milton Friedman have responded? Easily and in a single word: no. But it's important to understand why his answer is no. Does Milton Friedman have a problem with what the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation does? Probably not. Unfortunately, he's deceased. We can't ask him anymore, right? But the interesting thing is to understand why. I think lying behind what Friedman says about the social responsibilities of business is a kind of division of labor argument, right? Remember, Friedman was an economist, right? He made fundamental contributions, in addition to monetary theory, to price theory. And one thing he's terribly impressed by, as is his intellectual idol, Adam Smith, is the division of labor, right? Friedman understands that a firm is a support structure for an activity, right? That is, right, the firms that are most successful are firms that are set up, are firms that are structured to support the activities that they engage in, right? So Microsoft is an organization fitted to engaging in for-profit activities, right? In the division of labor, it includes both for-profit and not-for-profit activities. It is oriented around for-profit activity. Similarly, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation is fitted to, man, I'm still not sure how to pronounce this word, but I'm going to let fly. It is fitted to eliminatory activities. Now, I looked that up in the dictionary, and eliminatory is roughly a synonym for philanthropic. Why did I choose that word? Why didn't I just say philanthropic? Answer: it is a word that Friedman himself uses in The Social Responsibility of Business is to increase its profits. When he says a firm, an organization can be set up for any purpose its owners want to, right? So what's the point here? A kind of challenge that I think Friedman would throw here is he would say, Microsoft is excellent of its kind. The Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation is excellent of its kind. It's very important that we have both kinds, right? In other words, the history of Bill Gates founding two very different organizations to perform two very different functions shows that liberalism as a political philosophy worked exactly as it should. Against this backdrop, however, John Mackey, the recently retired founding CEO of Whole Foods, since sold to Amazon, very interesting. In a 2005 Reason magazine exchange with Milton Friedman, right, Mackey pushes back against Friedman's opposition to corporate social responsibility, saying that Whole Foods itself was built as an organization both to pursue profits and to pursue corporate social responsibility. Mackey knows Friedman's work very well, and he's a fan, right? Which means that he doesn't say stupid things against Friedman. One of the things that he recognizes is that Friedman, as a liberal, as a small L libertarian, has to be in favor of any activity pursued by anyone consensually. And he says, when we founded Whole Foods, we founded it at its inception to both pursue profit and to pursue corporate social responsibility. So shareholders in Whole Foods cannot complain because they knew what they were getting into when they bought the shares. Now, Mackey offers a very compelling defense of Whole Foods' efforts of corporate social responsibility. Why? Because they're baked right in to the founding of the firm and in the appeal that was made to the initial shareholders to become equity owners in the firm. However, Mackey's considerations offer no aid and comfort to those who aim to redirect a for-profit firm not set up to engage in CSR, to engage in CSR. And so this is what I was getting at earlier in saying that there are some implications here for which institutions and which firms are well positioned to deliver CSR. Friedman can have no principled objection to anyone setting up a firm to do that. He can have a principled objection in terms of the fiduciary concern with trying to reorient a firm not set up for that purpose to the purpose of corporate social responsibility. In closing, I want to add two other considerations that don't fall out of Friedman, but I think if you read him and you read other things, they are important. This here is just a riff on a very important book by one of my favorite thinkers, Alasdair MacIntyre. Of course, the book is called Whose Justice, Which Rationality? I will call this the question of whose society, which responsibility. This is a direct fallout of the diversity concern I talked about before, right? In other words, when people promote CSR, they seem to have this idea that it is their views and their values that are going to be reflected in CSR activities. And in his 1972 interview in Business and Society Review, Friedman said something very interesting that is relevant here. He said, "Let me give you an example that has often impressed me. During the 1930s, German businessmen used some corporate money to support Hitler. Was that a proper exercise of social responsibility? The people who preach this hogwash talk as if everyone is always in favor of the same things, and there is no problem about which causes the money should be spent to further. But of course, that's not the case." So in effect, I take this challenge as raised by Milton Friedman to be a be careful what you wish for challenge. For example, I'm sure there are people in the audience who aren't very interested in what Mr. Pillow Guy would do in the name of corporate social responsibility. Why are you so confident that things undertaken by corporations that you don't control in the name of CSR will reflect the views and values that you hope to be promoted through CSR. I want to close on this, the importance of non-expressive space. And I want to point out two things. The man on the left in the screen is, of course, the late Rush Limbaugh. The late Rush Limbaugh was, of course, a conservative talk radio personality of particular renown, at least in that world. One interesting thing about Rush Limbaugh, in light of all of this, is that Rush Limbaugh was a passionate user and unpaid promoter of Apple computers, of Apple Macintosh computers. This is something he talked about a great deal on his radio show. It's something that he waxed poetic about and all the rest. One time when Limbaugh was having trouble with his computer, he mentioned this on his show, and there were calls by some people who also use Apple computers, but who don't share Limbaugh's political orientations or values, for Apple to refuse to help him cure his computer problems. And that is something that bothers me a great deal, not because I share Rush Limbaugh's views and values, but because it is important that there be in our world non-expressive spaces where we are not just our views and values and our attempts to implement them, right? In that context, Rush Limbaugh, whatever else you or I may think of him, Rush Limbaugh was a computer user in distress. He should get customer service regardless of his views and values. But some people, in the name of corporate social responsibility, or in the name of something like corporate social responsibility, suggest that we should use opportunities like this to smite our foes and to hold up our fellows. I want to close with the man on the right, Alex Jones. I doubt there's anyone here who likes Alex Jones. I know I don't, right? But I came across something about him it was very interesting. A friend of a friend is a waiter in an Omaha restaurant that Alex Jones frequents when he comes to Omaha. And when Alex Jones comes to Omaha and frequents that restaurant, he asks for the friend of the friend to be his waiter. The friend of the friend, whom he asks to be his waiter, perfectly detests Alex Jones. And in a Facebook Messenger discussion with some friends, asked, "What should I do?" Well, I think I have an answer to that. What you should do is you should serve Alex Jones food, because you're in a non-expressive space, right? In that space, Alex Jones is hungry and he wants to eat. And in that space, you are a server of food to people who do that. If you think somehow that the right and the good and the just and the fair and the beautiful are going to be served by refusing to serve Alex Jones, or by agreeing to serve Alex Jones, but throwing the soup in his face when his soup course comes, you have, I think, a misguided view of where our views and values should hold sway. And so my worry about CSR goes back to the Galston quote. That is, I don't want to say that CSR is a totalitarian view or philosophy, but CSR, at least inadvertently, lends itself to a totalizing understanding of how views and values should play out in a society. And so it is for that reason that I think we should be skeptical of CSR. Now, again, I don't think I have advanced any considerations that foreclose the very possibility of CSR being pursued legitimately, but it does matter by whom and in what circumstances. And with that, I am done. Thank you very much for listening to me. I look forward to, well, whatever it is I'm supposed to do. I see something in the chat and something in the Q&A. I don't know what I'm to do with this. I think I'll start by doing that so that I can actually I can actually see. Ken Goodpaster.
All right.
I love Ken. Oh, Ken, I
So-
love you.
I'm glad. So thank you very much for such a wonderful presentation. We do have a few minutes for Q&A or for comments, and they're trickling in. So I want to start, since our guest speaker just noticed the first one of the first questions here from Ken Goodpaster. And so let me read it out to all the audience. And I can see that you know each other, so that is wonderful. So let me start with that one.
Oh, the love.
So here is the question. Do you think that the increasing entry of corporations into partisanship over the past decade illustrates the phenomenon that Milton Friedman feared, namely the gesture of a merger of the private sector into the public sector?
I think that a lot of Friedman's rhetoric about CSR being socialist, about CSR being a fundamentally subversive doctrine, right, is in some ways unfortunate. But I guess what I would say is that, yes, if Friedman were with us today, he would say, this is among the things I was concerned about. Whether it actually eventuates in a kind of merger of the private sector and the public sector, as the most excellent Professor Goodpaster asks, I don't know, but I think Friedman would say it's a step in that direction, and that's not a direction we want to be stepping. And I think that's where I am, and that's what I'm trying to get at with the idea of the importance of having and maintaining non-expressive spaces, right? Spaces where, just by virtue of being there, you're not endorsing some view or value or disavowing some view or value. I mean, I had this experience back in 2004, actually, while Friedman was still alive. That was a highly ugly, contested presidential election between George W. Bush and John Kerry. And there were a lot of people who were deeply invested in that election. So much so that I went to a restaurant in St. Louis that I loved. It has since closed, and I'm very sad about that, where certain items of the menu were identified as beat Bush items. And they even said, if you order this from the menu, we give $1 to the John Kerry for President campaign or whatever. And my first thought about that was, what an ugly thing. Not because I favored Bush over Kerry. In fact, if I could have that one over again, if I could have a do-over on 2004, I wish Kerry had won. Not because I necessarily have good thoughts about John Kerry, but I think I look at the historical timeline since then. I think about all sorts of bad things that would have been at least disrupted by it. But putting people in the position where ordering a dish on a menu is at least implicit support for a political outcome, I think is a really ugly thing. And yet we seem to have society-wide ever greater appetites for these sorts of things. Let's turn what in an earlier time were mundane choices into politically, into morally, into religiously, into social group promoting or smiting form. And I first of all, I think liberal society cannot survive that. Of course, a lot of people who are doing this have no particular affection for liberal society. I think liberalism is in decline, as we're all discovering. But I think that's a path once followed that we don't actually want to live with.
Thank you. Yeah, I have a lot of questions here, so I'm trying to sort out sort of which direction we can go. So let me go with this one. Are small local businesses better situated to engage in socially responsible activity than larger corporations like Microsoft?
Yes, they actually are, right? And one of the reasons for that is that you don't have the separation of ownership and control that informs the large corporation. In other words, the people who are committing funds to socially responsible initiatives are the people who are in effect paying for those funds, right? One thing that always bothered me about the affection in the business ethics and CSR literatures for Aaron Feuerstein, right? And, you know, when he ran Malden Mills, was not that they thought he was a great guy. Feuerstein was a great guy, right? But what made it possible for him to be a great guy and do what he did was that his was a closely held company, and all of the people who held ownership interests were on board with what he was. The idea in the business ethics field that Feuerstein is a model for those who run public corporations whose shareholders did not sign on for this, didn't seem to penetrate the heads of the people who were saying this. So in a short answer to the question is yes, the smaller the business firm, the lesser the problem, at least on the fiduciary component. You still run into problem of diversity, and what you do to make society better in the eyes of other people is making society worse. But I'm much warmer to that than I am to, say, a non-governmental organization seeking a meeting with the C-suite that ignores the shareholders and says, let's spend some of your money on corporate social responsibility initiatives. So yeah, I guess in this, I'm E.F. Schumacher. All is beautiful.
Okay. All right. I think I'm going to try to do one more question. I think, of course, you know, time is of the essence. So I don't want to, you know, for those of you who I know that
it's very nice
have
of
a
you
plan.
to say, Dina. What you're trying to say is I wasted it.
No, not at all. So one more question here. What are your thoughts about the view that corporations should take into account the risks associated with ESG factors? There was an earlier question kind of asking if the S in ESG is the same as the S in CSR. But so in terms of the thoughts of about the risks associated with ESG factors that impact the public's perception and could impact the long-term sustainability of an organization and its value. So I guess, yeah, so sort of.
You know, so here's another of my pet peeves, right? Should they consider it? Yes, of course they should consider it. The question is, what role should it play in the decision making, right? Is it a decisive role, right? Or is it a consideration that gets thrown on the scales along with other things? I mean, I suppose my problem with ESG, at least as it sits currently, is my problem with CSR, which is there's not a whole lot of agreement on what it is, right? There are as many different views of ESG as there are theorists promoting ESG. So when you tell me you should really be promoting ESG, my question is, which ESG should I be promoting? Right? And that gets back to the diversity problem. Even among people who share ESG concerns, they don't agree on the relative weight of the concerns that they share and how they figure into decision making. So, and again, going back to the other question, the smaller and more closely held the firm, the lesser the problem is in the firm engaging in it. So I'm sure that's unsatisfying to all sorts of people, but it's the best I can do in the time we have available.
Yes, well,
thank you for excellent questions, including the ones that I didn't see.
Yes, I'm sorry about that, but that we couldn't get to all the questions, although some of the comments here are really saying that they enjoyed your presentation and it was very thoughtful presentation. So I want to thank everyone who attended today's event. I definitely want to thank Dr. Marcoux. We do have another event upcoming, November 29th. So please keep tuned to what the center is doing. And have a lovely afternoon, and thank you very much. Bye.